Man, I love roguelike games, and I am so happy that they have become one of the most popular genres for indie game development over this past decade. Seriously, think of the quantity of good roguelike games that have come out since like 2015 alone. It is insane, but when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Not only has the roguelike formula become super refined, but these games just accept updates so easily, and that lets developers keep giving their fans content years down the line. And most importantly, attention spans are fucking small nowadays, and that session-based gameplay is a tried and tested method that gamers just love, even outside of the genre. Oh, you want proof? Okay. Well, what about Battle Royales? AKA multiplayer roguelikes. That's right, that's the mic drop. Fortnite is a fucking roguelike. It's session-based gameplay with permadeath, and yeah, there's no procedurally generated levels, but the multiplayer and loot acquisition acts as the random factor, and I will die on this hill. But that's not what this video is about. Because you see, for my first YouTube video, I want to talk about something that I love, and not, oh, well, you know. I mean, you know. Yeah, you know. I want to talk to you about Dungeon Crawlstone Soup, one of my favorite video games of all time, and one that I think is flying criminally under the radar of fellow roguelike lovers. Yes, this crusty-ass, unanimated, mini-clip looking ass game, this game, I believe deserves a seat up here with the big dogs of roguelike/roguelite legends, and even if I can't convince you of that in this video, hopefully we can still use the game as a lens to have a fun little analysis of what makes roguelikes so neat. So, if any of that sounds good to you, stay a while, and let's talk about Dungeon Crawlstone Soup. Okay, let me hit you with the when, why, hows of this game real quick. So, Dungeon Crawlstone Soup, or DCSS, was developed in 1995 and originally went by the title Lindley's Dungeon Crawl, named after the creator Lindley Hensel. At the time, the game's visuals were literally composed of ASCII art, but the game immediately gained a large cult following for its weird, innovative gameplay concepts. Lindley and his team would continue updating and developing the game until 2003, at which future developments kinda went silent. Now, the game's history at this point becomes a little murky, but from what I can gather, the only active developer at that time, Brent Ross, didn't want the game dying out, so he made it open source, and created the Stone Soup team, a group of committed DCSS lovers who would update and develop the game for years to come, ushering the creation of Dungeon Crawlstone Soup. Since then, dedicated fans and developers have been consistently updating the game, all for free, just out of love for the project. The game's premise is actually really simple. You select a race, a starting class, and you begin your crawl through this massive branching dungeon where each branch represents a different theme. You spend your time slaying, looting, leveling up, collecting weapons, spells, and artifacts, all so you can eventually become strong enough to collect the fabled Orb of Zot. If you can escape with the orb, you win. It's a classic 90s fantasy video game premise that is straight to the point. You gotta love it. As I mentioned, the game is currently free and open source. In fact, you can play it right now on your browser. Yeah, I know that might make it sound kinda cheap, but bear with me here, there's a lot to say about this game. Alright, let's cut the YouTube video essay bullshit and get into the juice. Why do I think the game is good? Well, let's talk about the gameplay. The game takes place on tile-based 2D 8-directional movement. While the gameplay is described as turn-based on the wiki, I actually find that description to be a bit misleading. Let me explain. So, in this game, nearly everything you can do exists in the form of actions, with the game pausing between your actions and each action costing a certain number of turns. Quicker things, like picking up a weapon, will cost you something like half a turn, whereas something like walking downstairs will cost you 1.7 turns. Enemies only get to act after one of your actions, and how much they get to do depends on how many turns your action costed. Now, that description is a little simplified. There's a bit more that goes into how much enemies get to act, including some really weird math, but for the sake of this video, all you need to understand is that everything in this game takes place under this action turn cost system. Combat, movement, exploration, and equipping items is all happening under the same umbrella, and things only happen when you do something. And this is kind of the first thing I love about this game. If you're an experienced player, or if you're just fighting some really easy enemies, you can rocket through encounters. But if you're new, or if you're fighting something you've never seen before, you can take all the time you want inspecting enemies, analyzing your position, deciding what move you want to do next. It's a really good way of putting the pacing of the game almost entirely in the player's hands, and it lets you decide the speed at which to play the game to meet your needs. The actual combat itself is very straightforward in concept. You can swing at enemies with your weapon in hand, and classic RPG style stats and skills decide your damage, hit chance, the speed of your swing, and so on. Of course, there are also ranged attacks, abilities that can summon creatures or even change terrain, and plenty of spells that are just brimming with early 2000s jank, but in the most charming way. One of them straight up one-shots any creature in the game if you just stand still next to them long enough. Any creature, even endgame bosses, and it's balanced! The point is, playing DCSS is easy, but knowing how to play DCSS is where the real challenge and real fun begins. There is a lot of strategy that goes into how you approach enemies in this game, and it's often directly involved with positioning. Things like leading enemies to choke points so you can avoid being surrounded and face them one by one, summoning fog to block line of sight between you and enemy casters, using a weird tool you found like a wand or a throwing net to tip the scales of an encounter in your favor. The depth of this game's strategy would be impossible to cover in just one video, but it really is the tactical movement and positioning strategy of a fighting game mixed with the critical decision making of a turn-based game, and the two really do work remarkably together. Of course, being the best at killing things isn't always necessarily the best option in this game. Your objective is to collect the Orb of Zot and escape the dungeon with it. That's all. If you're tricky enough, you can sometimes finesse your way past enemies to achieve your goals, either through stealth, hexes, or other funky means the game offers you. Surviving enemy encounters in DCSS is all about wielding these little advantages and opportunities the game has you build for yourself throughout your run. The game does very little hand-holding for you, sometimes too little to be honest, but you are rewarded for your patience and planning, and in that aspect, the game does an incredible job of making you feel like you've earned every single one of your victories. Alright, before we can move on, I'm gonna have to do a little gamer lesson time, so everyone open up their gamer books, take out your mandatory Funko Pop pens, you have to have these to keep watching the video, I'm serious. This lesson is going to be on the difference between roguelikes and roguelights. Nowadays, we only release the term roguelike, but there is a distinction that's relevant to this video. Okay, so both genres involve a crawl or a run through procedurally generated levels. Both genres have permadeath. If you die, it's back to the very start. Both will usually have you collect upgrades or items that help you progress further, and oftentimes both will have the same goal of just trying to make it to the end. Now here's where the two start to differ. See, in Roguelights, you get to carry some things into your next run, usually in the form of unlocks. This progression can be in the form of new abilities, new characters, new items, new levels, and so on. But in traditional roguelikes, each time you begin, you start from the bare bones beginning. There are no unlocks, no progression to be made between runs. All you have going with you into your next session is your own skill and experience you've gained from your previous one. Now, unsurprisingly, roguelights have become the much more popular choice nowadays. Tangible progression in the form of unlocks is a massive driving force for the player, and unlocks make losing a lot less discouraging since when you lose, you often receive rewards for the milestones you hit. Also, for a game you're paying for, roguelights make a lot more sense from a consumer perspective, since traditional roguelikes can just sort of feel like glorified arcade games. Now, of course, the definitions for any genre should be taken as guidelines and not rules, and for the rest of this video, I'm just going to be calling all of them roguelikes because that's what we're all used to. But the reason I wanted to point out this distinction is because Dungeon Crawlstone Soup is a true old-fashioned traditional roguelike, and that might be an immediate turnoff for some people, but give me a chance to try and convince you otherwise. If you'll let me do a bit of concession and refutation, your concerns are probably running along the lines of, won't I just get bored of the game? Won't I see it all after one successful run? Well, here's the thing. First of all, it's free, but second of all, and way more importantly, DCSS runs are fucking long. Most roguelikes will hover anywhere from 20 minutes on the low end to an hour on the high end, maybe 2 hours for some games. In Dungeon Crawlstone Soup, depending on how many branches you want to clear, runs can go anywhere from about 6 hours on the low end to 12 hours, sometimes more if you're going for a complete victory. Full DCSS runs are not expected to be done in one sitting, and this fact alone dramatically changes how this game is structured compared to other roguelikes. So, for every pro and con I bring up for the rest of this video, it's important that we remember that crucial piece of context. This game is so fundamentally different because it's expected to be played over a significantly larger period of time. And with that context out in the open now, let's talk about how DCSS uses these long-ass runs as one of its greatest strengths. Okay, so 6 to 12 hours is a long time. There are some whole ass games that are that long, so what's keeping you there? What's making you want to play through that whole run? Alright, now we're getting into my favorite part. Builds. Oh my god, I love making builds. It is my favorite thing to do in video games, tabletop games, any game period, because it's to me the most expressive form of gameplay that I can imagine. Letting your player craft an identity for themselves by letting them mix and match various gameplay tools and actually rewarding them for their creativity, I love that shit. I live for it, and Dungeon Crawlstone Soup is able to do build making in such a cool way because of its longer length than other roguelikes. You are spending hours collecting so many different kinds of loot, spells, leveling so many different skills. The number of paths that you can diverge on are countless. Alright, let me just flex the scope of this game's build making real quick. So, there are 27 different races to pick from, and a lot of the time, the main differences between them is what aptitudes they have for the game's 31 different skills, but some completely remix how you play the game. There's a cat race that can't wield weapons or armor but is super quick and stealthy. There's a mummy race that can't use potions but have a bunch of resistances. A demon race that gets a bunch of random mutations every few levels, like claws or the ability to detect enemies through walls. And then there's also 25 different gods you can worship, giving you boons that mix up the game even further. There's a god that lets you straight up bribe enemies with cash, one that lets you warp to an endgame area anytime and use it as a safe zone, but there are still gods and races that provide basic buffs if you're looking for something more straightforward, because this game truly does have gameplay styles for anyone. One of my favorite gods, Byo, is exclusive to the Hill Orc race, and you start worshipping him by finding another orc priest in the dungeon to convert you. His whole concept is that as you progress through the dungeon, you convince other orcs that you fight that you're the legendary orc messiah, and as you delve, you start rallying an entire army of orc believers that you can eventually start micromanaging and sharing gear with, turning the game into a fucking pseudo RTS. It's so weird, but so cool. This game is not afraid to throw you some whack, unconventional options all throughout your run, and it can afford to do so because since run lengths are so long, the game is able to give each of those niche options the time and care to become fully functioning, fully fleshed out game mechanics instead of just weird gimmicks. Using Byo as an example, that feeling of slowly gathering an army of orcish believers that level up and loot with you probably couldn't be executed nearly as well in a game with shorter run length. Another huge advantage that lengthy runs bring to build making in this game is that it allows for this really fun improvised build making dynamic. You definitely can start a run with a single build in mind and streamline towards it, and that can work sometimes, but you are coming across so many different resources in a single run that retailoring your build to what's available is often a lot more effective. It makes for this really interesting gameplay element of making the most of what's given to you, and it often ends up in you making builds that you wouldn't have even thought about. For example, while trying to get footage for this video, I went for a super basic Troll Berserker build. It's a bread and butter combo that's great for 3 rune runs, especially since trolls have access to one of the best throwing weapons in the game, large rocks. But early in the run, I come across this spell, Bornyor's Vile Clutch. It's a necromancy earth spell that damages and roots enemies, holding them in place and making them take a huge penalty to their evasion stat. So I started thinking, well, hey, trolls do have an alright aptitude for earth magic and only a slightly bad one for necromancy, plus this spell could synergize super well with rock throwing since I could lock enemies down and pelt them with boulders while their evasion stats are cut. So I start building towards it, and yeah, that combo fucking slayed. I ended up getting like 11 runes or something before I died to some stupid shit. And I didn't do that build because I found it on a top 10 most broken DCSS builds video, but because I saw what the game threw at me and adapted my build to take advantage of it. And that run was honestly some of the most fun I've had with a roguelike game because I just felt so empowered and happy tearing apart the game with this weird combo I felt like I discovered for myself. You get so many opportunities for stuff like this in your runs, and it is so fun. And when I lost that run, God, it sucked. And that does bring me to the last thing I want to talk about in regards to how long DCSS's runs are. You can get really invested in these runs. I guess that's kind of to be expected when you're sinking literal hours into a character, but it really does make each run feel special and distinct because your character becomes this culmination of the hours of effort and planning you spend, managing your skill leveling and collecting different artifact weapons or spells that are tailored to your build. If your character dies and you're past the 4-hour mark, there is a good chance you'll never have that particular character's loadout until many, many runs later, maybe never. And that constant threat of potentially losing your character is both a benefit and a detriment to the game. Let's start with why I think it's a good thing by talking about how this game approaches risk-reward gameplay with something I like to call the how far can I push this method. It's something my favorite games of all time do, and you've probably encountered it before as well. Not knowing where the next bonfire is in Dark Souls, making you question whether you should push forward or just play it safe to go back to deposit your souls. Whether or not you can afford to send your strongest hero on a perilous mission in Darkest Dungeon with the least amount of resources possible. Fucking hard mode Minecraft, whether you should keep exploring a cave even though you're running low on food. When a game has me thinking, how far can I push this, it has successfully trapped me in an obsessive risk-reward balancing act that I love to be in, because goddamn, when you pull those stunts off, it is one of the most empowering feelings a video game can give you. And DCSS wields the how far can I push this concept like it's Thor with fucking Mjolnir. It is insane how well this game works with this idea, and it's primarily because the objective of the game, collecting and escaping with the Orb of Zot, is entirely built around this premise. See, in DCSS, there are 15 runes of power to collect, and each is hidden away at the bottom of most of the dungeon's many themed branches, but here's the thing, you only actually need 3 to be able to pick up the Orb of Zot, so if you wanted to, you could do the 3 easiest branches for your build, grab the orb, and book it, and honestly that is what I would recommend for beginner players, because the game gets pretty fucking tough later on. But you and I both know you won't do that. If you're anything like me, we both know that you won't settle for anything but the full 100% complete true ending. You want that 15 rune run because you're not some little baby playing baby games, you're a fucking gamer. And so every time you pick up a rune past the 3rd one, you're thinking to yourself, can I go for another one? Which branch would be the safest? Or what resistances am I missing? What item prep do I need to do? What spells should I try and get? And boom, you are now Dungeon Crawl's bitch. Suddenly the game is having you do mental gymnastics to justify what batshit strategies you have to pull off to get that next rune or optimize your niche melee caster build. And god does it feel good when you're walking that tightrope, asking yourself, how far can I push this? Because Dungeon Crawl will show you exactly how far you can push it and make you feel good for taking those risks. Add the fact that the stakes in this game are 100 times higher since you're committing way more hours into runs, and you have some of the most thrilling risk-reward gameplay in any game I've played ever. But I did mention that this was also a detriment, and that's because when you do lose, and you will, because this game is fucking hard, it can be pretty disheartening. And it wouldn't be so bad if every one of your losses were because of honest mistakes, and I do think that that is the case like 90% of the time, but this game does have flaws, and while I would love to just gush to you about how wonderful Dungeon Crawl is, I want this video to be an honest representation, so that, all 4 people who watch this and actually try out the game don't feel like I've been misleading them on what to expect. First and foremost, on the visual level, the game obviously hasn't aged terribly well. Remember, this game was built on the foundation of mid-90s indie game graphics, but that being said, there's still some pretty charming sprite work, and different dungeon branches do have distinct atmospheres to them, which is lended to those quality pieces of pixel art. And despite the game's outdated visuals, it still does a great job of maintaining visual clarity on the screen, which is definitely the most important part when talking about a strategy game where your position, the enemy's positions, and any field effects needs to be importantly communicated to the player. The next piece of criticism that I wanted to bring up is that the game is definitely a bit of a knowledge sink. While I do think recent updates have made the game way more friendly towards beginners, you still need to spend a decent amount of time learning what different enemies do, how different abilities work, what the game's various status effects do, and just generally getting more comfortable playing the game. You're probably going to need to die to each enemy at least once before you start knowing how to deal with them, and that can definitely be pretty disheartening for beginners. And listen, I don't entirely think that a game that demands a lot of learning from the player is necessarily a bad thing. If I haven't made it obvious, the game definitely rewards you for putting in the effort, but getting used to the game can feel pretty jarring nonetheless. Lastly, let's talk about the game's difficulty. Difficulty is always a pretty touchy subject when it comes to games, and the DCSS community is particularly touchy to criticisms of difficulty from my experience, but I feel like it's almost mandatory to mention it in a video trying to convince people to play this game, because it is really challenging. I'm a fucking dweeb, guys. I play a lot of video games. My favorite franchise is the Souls series, and DCSS is without a doubt the most difficult game I've ever played. And because you are committing so much time and effort per run, it's really important that the game doesn't betray your trust when you lose in regards to what feels fair and what doesn't. I'd say that like 95% of the time, when you die in DCSS, it is your fault, whether you were playing recklessly like I usually do, or forgot to bring the appropriate resistances for a specific area, blah blah blah. But that 5% of the time, the game fucks you with some 90s game design bullshit like randomly falling into a shaft and being dropped next to 3 ultra powerful enemies, or miscasting a spell on a 2% chance, it stings. And yeah, 5%, that's pretty infrequent, but once again, when the player is spending literal hours on a run, infrequent hiccups become a lot more detrimental to the gameplay experience, because not only are you encountering them more, but their consequences become way more frustrating. Luckily, this game still receives fairly frequent updates, and with each iteration they are doing a good job of modernizing the game with hashing out the bullshit. After all, the game has had the benefit of, existing for almost 20 years, so even though there's some outdated concepts, there's also a level of polish that could really only exist once a game has gone through literal decades of playtesting. I couldn't really decide whether I wanted this to be a persuasive or informative video, and at the end of the day, I think I just really wanted to talk about a game that's been close to my heart for a long time, and is in my opinion critically underappreciated. Like seriously, I like to think I have pretty good taste in video games, but I think the most viewed Dungeon Crawlstone Soup video on YouTube has like 30,000 views. It is not a very popular game, and while it's definitely not perfect, it is beyond me why people haven't started noticing this game more, especially in this era of roguelike games. So if this video does get you to try it out, please let me know what you thought. Even if you hated it, I will take any excuse I can to talk about this game more. Oh, and if this video does, by some miracle, get people to start playing this game, I would be more than happy to make guide videos and, stuff like that, because there aren't really many of those floating around, and I'm definitely not the best dungeon crawl player, but I would love to do what I can to make the game more approachable to beginners. So if that's something that any of you want, be sure to let me know. In the meantime, if you're really starved for more DCSS content, may I suggest checking out Ultraviolent 4's channel. He does a lot of gameplay with really informative commentary that has definitely helped me learn more about the game in the past. Otherwise, I hope you liked my funky little analysis of cool roguelike elements, and I hope this video gave you an idea of the kind of content I want to make in the future. I'll probably make that video justifying why I think Fortnite is a roguelike, and I definitely want to do a lot of talking about Elden Ring when that comes out, because, who the fuck isn't going to be playing Elden Ring? So yeah, subscribe if any of that sounds good to you, and I hope you have a good holiday. Bye for now.